do I identify as? I guess Asian. Chinese, specifically Chinese American. I think there's been, especially in media, like good progress, right, with greater representation, and diversity of representation, meaning, like, there were, like, Chinese Americans maybe in film or TV, but it was in those, like, small roles, right, where it's, like, the token minority, right, kind of thing. Whereas now I feel like there's been a big push, at least in the last few years, right, to have greater representation in media. And there's more, there's that big deal with the movie that came out, was it last year, the Crazy Rich Asians, right, where, like, the entire cast was Asian, right, and appropriately so, because that's, the stories of Asian people. Whereas in the past, though, you'd have, like, white actors, like, playing Asian roles. So I feel like there's been a lot of progress, and I do see a lot more representation. I still feel, though, sorry, I'm rambling on. Is that okay? Okay. I feel like there's a lot more that can happen, especially, like, I have small kids, right? And that's something I actually really think about trying to, like, make sure that they see themselves, right, in the world, in the things they watch. Although at this, at their age, it's like a lot of non-human characters, right, in books and in TV. But whenever there are human characters, like, I like go to library book sales to try to find books where there's, like, kids of color, right, in it, where it's not about them being a kid of color. Does that make sense? Where that's not the focus. It's just like, oh, they happen to be an Asian kid in this story, Because I feel like I want my kids to be surrounded by images of themselves. So I feel like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, when you watch, like, kids' TV, right, or even the books, like children's books. So, yeah, compared to when I was in high school, there's been a lot of progress, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be made.
What was it like when you were in high school?
I'm trying to think, so long ago. Like, I don't know.
Where did you go to high school?
I went to St. Francis, actually, yeah. Huh?
Here?
Yeah, like in Mountain View, yeah. That was interesting, actually, because I do feel, I think it's like that even today, right? You have a lot of, sure, kids interact with each other, and St. Francis was a bit, I don't know how it is now, but I know the student body's smaller than it is here, right? I think there's about 350 to 400 students in my grade, whereas here it's like 600 or so, right? So it was a bit smaller. So there were people who knew each other, but I think we really very much segregated into groups, I think, although my friends that I hung out with was kind of mixed. But I feel like one thing, how do I say this, for me, I didn't feel like there was as much of talk of, like, diversity, right? It was more like, oh, let's all sort of melt together, right? And you had less, I don't know how to say it, like, there's less of an emphasis on diversity and differences, right? Because it was like, oh, that's potentially a source of conflict and a bad thing, right? To identify different racial or ethnic groups and distinguish yourself that way, right? But to me, that's actually a loss, right? Because I think, like, there's a lot of value in, like, if we want to truly a world where people see each other as equals, we should be accepting of, like, all these different racial and ethnic groups as, like, equally, and their cultures as equally, like, valuable, right? And so when we're not embracing differences, when we're ignoring differences, in a way, we're devaluing them, right? So I feel like when I was in high school, there wasn't much of, like, and maybe it was just me individually. I don't know. Maybe it's just who I hung out with, but there wasn't a sense of, like, oh, I'm an Asian American. Like, I didn't have that same sense of identity that maybe I developed a little bit later, right, in college. So I wish that was there, that there's more of a celebration of diversity, right? And I feel like there is, thinking about Homestead, I feel like, oh, there are groups, here that do celebrate, and I like that, and I don't know. I wonder what it's like for, like, you all, like, high school kids. Because I know I see you every day, but I don't know, it's more focused on academics, right? But I don't know. I guess I'm curious to hear from you, like.
Interested in learning about the other cultures.
Yeah, and I feel like a value. I know for me, like this is less about high school, but just growing up, like in the American school system, like I don't speak Chinese. Like both my parents do, but the messaging I got growing up as a kid here was, you should speak English, right? That's what's important. And like, I mean, it wasn't part of the English only movement. I feel like that was a little. Well, maybe it was. I'm trying to think when that happened, like 90s or so. But it's definitely like here. I feel. We encourage you to be bilingual. I mean, obviously it's a different world now where that is important, maybe more so than when I was younger. But I'm not I got the message throughout my schooling in America that like, yeah, you want to assimilate, right? Speak English and kind of adopt white middle class culture, which I hope isn't the messaging anymore. But I don't know, right? Like at least that's not the message I send out, but I don't know how it is in other schools or in other classrooms. So I think that is different now. I feel like there is more of an embracement of differences, and that's something that you should, as a kid, keep, right, and not lose as you're going through our school system. Yeah, that's the whole thing, right, with history and representation. I remember I was reading this book for my book club it's called like what's it called? I don't know. The Invisible Women, right, and like the data gap for women. That's not the exact title. I'm like paraphrasing it, but it's looking at that, how like, just in data, like a lot of times women, right, they're not included in the data sets, and so you kind of just, make decisions based on like the data from males, and men and women are different, right? So sometimes the decisions that are made don't actually harm women, right, because they're based on data from men. So the same thing with history, right? So often we think of like males acting in history because that's what we study, whereas like women are half of history, you know what I mean? And so that's something I know my A-push class especially, I'm trying to work on like incorporating better representation, right, of women, of non-whites, right? And not that like, your textbook is focused on kind of the presidents, right? It's all white males, except, with Barack Obama, right? But he's not even included, right, in the curriculum. But, so not to say they weren't important, right? Because they were. I mean, presidents do play an important role in American history. But to only focus on that, like your textbook kind of organizes all the information around, like, presidents, right, and their administrations. Like, I feel it leaves out, then, all these other people, right, that played a role in history. And so for me, as a history teacher, I really try to increase representation of groups that aren't represented in kind of the traditional textbooks, right? So that's something I consciously work towards.
What have you noticed?
I mean, I think obviously, it does. History is important. But I think, I guess looking especially in the 60s and 70s, right, you do have kind of this raising of consciousness, right, of people of color in the U.S. And those movements, I think, continue today, right, to really push for equality and equal rights among everyone. And I think part of it, like getting back to, there's history and then there's the study of history, right, which are kind of two different things. And I think the study of history needs to improve, right, or the way it's taught needs to improve to show students that, like, yeah, people of color did play an important role, right, in American history. Or even take, for example, I mean, there's this huge debate on immigration now, right, about, like, with Trump and his administration trying to restrict immigration, right? But if you have been taught that immigrants have actually played a huge role, an important role in building America, which they have, right, I think you would have different views on immigrants today, right? Whereas if you have a curriculum that really doesn't show the value, the contributions of immigrants, you won't see their value today.